kind of bullshit city, in this bullshit country, with the bullshit cops beating up on the demonstrators and protesters, the real peacemakers, when they should be beating up on the war makers, and the haters and the killers. Well, it's bullshit, man. Bullshit.
The American counterculture of the 1960s and 70s was reacting to the conservative attitudes of the previous generation. One of the most vocalized opinions this youth counterculture had was the opposition to the war in Vietnam. The number of youths in college during the 1960s and 70s was higher than it had ever been in America before because the children of the baby boomers were finally coming of age. The teenagers with radical and revolutionary ideas flocked to college campuses around the country, bringing their beliefs with them. Protests and riots were a common occurrence amongst these youngsters with such strong beliefs. College students often protested U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was the longest and most protested war in U.S. history. One of the most famous and tragic of these protests was the Kent State Massacre at Kent State University in Ohio in May of 1970.
On Friday, May 1st, 1970, the day after President Nixon's announcement of the beginning of the Cambodian incursion, about 500 students at Kent State University gathered on the Commons to protest the expansion of the Vietnam War into Cambodia. When the group dispersed for classes at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, another rally was planned for the following Monday, May 4th. The next day, the decision was made to call in the National Guard from Washington, D.C. They arrived around 10 o'clock p.m., and there was already a riot underway, with the campus ROTC building burning. Tear gas was used to disperse the crowd, and many arrests were made. The next day, the governor of Ohio gave a press conference at the Kent State Firehouse, calling the students un-American and saying,
"We've seen here at the city of Kent especially probably the most vicious form of campus-oriented violence, yet perpetrated by dissident groups. They make definite plans of burning, destroying, and throwing rocks at police and at the National Guard and the Highway Patrol. This is when we're going to use every part of the law enforcement agency of Ohio to drive them out of Kent. We are going to eradicate the problem."
Another rally was held on the campus commons that night, which was again dispersed with tear gas.
On Monday, the rally was scheduled for noon, and despite many attempts to cancel it by officials, over 2,000 students showed up. The National Guard moved in to disperse the protesters, and they responded by throwing rocks and yelling, "Pigs off campus" at the guards. At 12:24 p.m., one of the National Guard members opened fire on the protesters. 29 of the 77 National Guard members soon followed, emptying 67 rounds of ammunition on the crowd. In the end, 4 students were dead and another 9 were wounded. The 4 bodies discovered dead were Allison Cross, 19 years old, Sandra Lee Schuer, 20, Jeffrey Glenn Miller, 20, and William K. Schroeder, 19. Later that day, everyone was ordered by court injunction to immediately leave campus and return home. The entire campus was closed and new rules were set in place. Kent now had a 5 p.m. curfew and no one was allowed to enter the town. Roadblocks were even put in place for prevention. 2 towns surrounding Kent were declared a state of emergency.
All the students involved in the Kent State Massacre remembered what they saw, what they heard, and most of all, how they felt as they were protesting at Kent State University, especially regarding its unfortunate outcome. Al Confornia states that he was
unarmed anti-war Kent State University student when I decided to stand and fight.
He recalls the events of May 4th, 1970, stating that
about 1,000 students had joined the protest rally, but classes were being held on campus as usual. We assumed we could still exercise our constitutional rights of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom to dissent. Immediately as our peaceful anti-war rally began, approximately 75 members of the Ohio National Guard attacked our peaceful gathering. As these guardsmen wearing helmets and gas masks marched and fired tear gas, we ran away from the KSU Commons up over Blanket Hill and down into the Prentice Hall dormitories parking lot.
Al Confornia was shot in the wrist for being involved in the riots, yet that was seen as fortunate compared to the outcomes of some of his classmates. He said it
was the ultimate surreal moment to survive such a near-death experience, especially when the shooters were aiming, in particular, at me and others.
Another student, Ellis Burns, took part in the protest and even witnessed his friend Sandy Scoocher get shot and killed. He recalls remembering,
"The guard was not letting anybody in, and they were pointing guns. I remember I ripped off my jacket, this green fatigue jacket with Sandra's blood, and I threw it at them, and I told him he could go F himself. I was just livid. I didn't know what to do."
Another student, Naomi Etzkin, a fellow student at Kent State, recalls her involvement in the anti-war protest and her disbelief of what actually happened. She remembers hearing students
taunting and jeering at the guards, calling to them to get off the campus. In that moment, without any warning, we heard the gunshots. We did not believe that they were real bullets. We thought they were shooting into the air, and we just didn't believe that the bullets could be real. And we went running back into our dormitory as the ambulances came over the hill. People began coming back into the dorm, having walked over bleeding bodies. We then went to a window and watched Dr. Frank address the students who were still on the hill. Everybody sat down in shock, and he said that, to the best of my recollection, that something like, they had already committed murder, and they can do it again. Now I want you to follow me off this hill.
He says that after the events of May 4th, 1970, the campus was never the same.
Sylvester Del Corso, adjutant general of the Ohio National Guard, said later that the guardsmen shot into the crowd after a sniper opened fire on them from a nearby rooftop. The assistant adjutant general, Frederick P. Wagner, said similarly that
they were understanding orders to take cover and return any fire.
However, no students reported seeing a sniper or hearing any gunfire before the shots fired by the guards. President Nixon reacted to the shooting with a press conference, saying,
"This should remind us all once again that when dissent turns into violence, it invites tragedy. It is my hope that this tragic and unfortunate incident will strengthen the determination of all the nation's campuses, administrators, faculty, and students alike to stand firmly for the right which exists in the country of peaceful dissent and just as strong against the resort to violence as a means of such expression."
The callousness of Nixon's tone led many to believe that the president cared more about the threat to his programs than the human blood that was shed.
The Kent State Massacre has been the only factor in U.S. history that has caused a nationwide student strike in our country. According to the research of Dr. George Katsifikis, 850 colleges and universities in the United States were shut down due to the Kent State shootings, with the involvement of over 4 million students protesting. In the month of May 1970, approximately 80% of U.S. colleges and universities experienced protests, and 30 ROTC buildings were burned or bombed by students prior to May 16, 1970. Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren even stated that Kent State sparked the worst American crisis since the Civil War. It turned out that the students were not alone in their protests. Approximately 175,000 faculty members joined in the protests. On May 16, 1970, Businessweek magazine warned,
"This is a dangerous situation. It threatens the whole economic and social structure of the nation."
The news of this appalling event spread throughout the country and world almost instantaneously. Disturbing photographs were distributed in magazines, and the whole world was made aware of the horrible events. One Kent State photojournalism student, John Philo, photographed a 14-year-old runaway, Mary Ann Vecchio, screaming over the body of Jeffrey Miller, a dead student who had just been shot. His photograph won a Pulitzer Prize and became a symbol of the horrors of the Kent State Massacre to the eyes of the world. His particularly famous photograph conveyed to the world the endurance of the anti-Vietnam War movement.
The Kent State Massacre was a disgrace to the democracy of the United States. The government had turned to shooting its own innocent civilians acting within their legal rights. This sparked controversy between the already divided generations on whether the U.S. military actions were justified or unjustified. On June 13, 1970, President Nixon created the President's Commission of Campus, which studied the outbreaks and violence throughout U.S. college campuses. Finally, in September 1970, the findings of the commission were issued and revealed that the May 4, 1970 Ohio National Guard shootings were in fact unjustified.